Thank you so much, Brooke. And the perfect follow-on to Brooke's presentation is we welcome back Allison Cardona. And Allison will be discussing cultural responsiveness in animal sheltering and animal management.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us. And with me, I'm learning so much today. And I appreciate that Brooke also, I feel like she set this up perfectly, introducing the idea of self-gratification and saviorism. I will be talking about cultural responsiveness. And I think it's important first to talk about what that looks like from a saviorism perspective. But before I get into that, I wanted to also acknowledge that I think with land acknowledgements, it's also important to talk or to acknowledge land back movements about returning land to First Peoples and to Indigenous peoples. And this is something that also comes up in the US and involves reparations. So I wanted to make that note. I wanted to tell you a little bit more about my own journey because I am going to be talking about saviorism, and I think it's important to acknowledge my own path and my own journey and also the draw to it and understanding that not only is there a self journey, but there's also a societal journey in the way that we really have been set up in modern society, post-colonization, to really be in savior mode. This is a photo of me with my family when I was younger. I talked earlier about getting a cat. I have loved cats since the age of 3. I carried this cat around everywhere. This cat was very, very tolerant of me and allowed me to hold him in any way. We did not know about desexing, as I mentioned earlier, and this cat named Rusty actually ended up running away. He found, a mate. He left me for other females. It was my first abandonment and hurt deeply. But I really, from a young age, really connected with animals. And I think I really connected with this idea of saving things and of being heroic. I felt a lot of value in that. I think that I also came to an animal welfare place thinking about helping. And it wasn't necessarily from a framework of saving, but it was of helping. And I think a really pivotal moment for me was in 2005, there was Hurricane Katrina that happened in the United States. And that was really a shifting moment for animal welfare, where people really saw that people would not leave without the animals in their care, without their companion animals. And I, at the time, was working for the ASPCA, and I actually participated in what was called rescue. So we drove down in the middle of the night from New York City down to Louisiana and started going door to door and rescuing animals that had been left behind because their owners didn't have any choices. And there's a couple of side story to that, is that was when I first really understood the disparities in how people were treated, in particular people, because actually in many of the places that we were going to, there were still people there who had not been evacuated, and they said that they hadn't received any care for themselves and that the animals were receiving care first before they were. That was one thing. But the other thing that I really saw there was the appeal of almost quite literally putting on a cape and coming down and providing this sense of rescue or relief to people who I perceived to be in need. So I share that because I think that there is a big draw, and I think a lot of people come to this line of work because they want to help. But I think it's important to talk about saviorism before talking about cultural responsiveness, and really helping about a definition. So I'll give that to you now. So it's really a symptom which places those in a position of privilege into the role of savior over those who have historically been oppressed and exploited. So we see this, as I said, this is not unique to animal welfare. It's not unique to this industry. We see this in other social services as well, in the framework and the way that things have been created in modern society. This idea of one group knowing and possessing more knowledge over another, and then going in and applying resources or sharing with people what they think is the proper way to handle certain things, handle their children, handle their animals, and handle any other thing in their life. So at this point, I'd really like you to take a moment and ask yourself, in the animal welfare and in your own organizations, is this something, and you don't have to share, you don't have to raise your hand, but just reflect if any of this resonates with you. Have you ever created a program without input from the community members who are going to be affected? Have you ever emphasized the poor conditions of the community members that you're serving in an effort to raise funds for your organization? Have you ever taken a pet from one family who couldn't afford veterinary care, repaired the pet, provided medical resources, and then adopted out that pet to a wealthier family or a family living in a different area? This is just something for you to reflect on. And I can share that early on in my career, this is also things that I've done myself. So what's the antidote to that? And I think we heard from Brooke, and we heard about community wisdom from Jeremiah. And the antidote to saviorism can really be looked at as cultural responsiveness. So what does that mean to be culturally responsive? And I want to make a note that initially I thought about using cultural competency, but when you talk about competency, it really implies more of tolerance. And this is really about being responsive and learning with others and understanding that we are not the experts. So cultural responsiveness really has cultural safety at its core. It incorporates learning, continuous self-exploration, and reflection. And it's a new way of thinking about culture. It's being open to new ideas that may conflict with the ideas, beliefs, and values of one's own, and seeing those differences as equal, not seeing them as less than or even wrong. And as I mentioned, it's really recognizing community wisdom and a new way of learning. And if you'd like more information on this as well, it's actually a resource that I found here in Australia. It's called the Agency for Clinical Innovation. And I would also highly recommend, and I can put this in the app as well, there's an organization in the US called Companions and Animals for Reform and Equity. The acronym is CARE. And they're really doing a wonderful job of talking more about cultural responsiveness and about community wisdom within marginalized communities that have been excluded from our animal welfare movement over time. So I wanted to share some examples in different areas: adoptions, return to home, veterinary services, some examples of what saviorism can look like, and then some alternatives and what anti-saviorism approach or culturally responsive approach could be. So we've talked a lot today about adoptions. You heard me talk earlier about removing barriers. So having a conversation-based approach would be more of a culturally responsive lens, understanding that some people might not call their animal a pet, and being respectful of that, and coming from a place of understanding and learning about where a person feels most comfortable keeping this animal in their home and what are the needs that they have. Always starting from a place of yes, rather than trying to exclude or trying to cross people off a list. And once again, coming back to multiple languages. I really appreciated hearing about the nuances of languages and dialect within language. It made me think of in Los Angeles in California, where I live, as I mentioned earlier, and I should make a correction to this, that Spanish is the second most popular language, or language that's spoken. But what they actually found when they started to talk to more community members and people who had immigrated from other countries is that actually there were 26 indigenous languages that were spoken by people who had immigrated from countries in Central and South America. And that by only providing language in Spanish, they were actually excluding folks where indigenous languages were their first language and that they had limited Spanish available. So it's really finding those nuances and appreciating that there's deeper levels below each category. So a culturally responsive way to look at adoptions would also be to say that returns are okay. There's something that I've been suggesting lately, which is actually exchanges. If something doesn't work out with an adoption, bring the pet back and we'll give you another one that same day, or if it's maybe too emotional for you on that day, another day that you come. Because once again, folks are gonna get pets in other places, so they might as well come to us. I also wanted to talk about return to home. And this is something we struggle a lot with in the US. And it sounds like a little bit here as well. Animals that end up in shelters, how do they get returned back to their actual homes? And whatever that home may be considered. If it's an outdoor home, if it's an indoor home, if it's a collective home that maybe it's semi-owned or different people are caring for the pet, how do we return those animals home? And I can tell you the statistics in the US are very low. When a cat enters a shelter in the US, it has about a 1% to 2% chance of being reunited with its home. Dogs generally have more in like the 10 to 15%. Actually, it might be a little higher. I think it's 1 in 4 dogs end up being returned to their home once they've entered a shelter. So we've definitely had to look at thinking about it in the perspective of saviorism versus cultural responsiveness. If we're looking from a saviorism lens, we're thinking the animals are loose, we're doing what's best for the animals don't belong outside, they need to be contained, and we're teaching folks a lesson. If we're looking at it from a culturally responsive approach, things happen. I saw someone mention something about fence repairs. Oh, actually, I think it was in one of the questions that one of the biggest reasons that animals were entering shelters was lack of fence repairs. So the problem is being presented. People can't afford or aren't able to fix their fences. So instead of keeping those animals and then adopting them out or maybe euthanizing, how about we fix the fences instead and provide, it's actually a lot less costly to fix a fence than it would be to house an animal and then try to rehome it. I also wanted to talk about fees associated with return to home, and this is something, again, that we struggle with in the US. And I did a quick search of some of your local, I think you call them cities or councils, and the register of fees and charges. And for a dog, it looked like a fee for impoundment was $132. And then each day, the first day of overnight stay was free, subsidized, but then any subsequent stay was $28.40. And then the dog needed to be microchipped prior to release. So you're already looking at several $100s in order for a dog to go back home. And it was a little less for cats, but it was about $100 for the fee for impoundment, and then again, $28.40 per day. This is similar in the US. It can vary. It can cost anywhere from $100 to sometimes thousands of dollars to retrieve your pet from a shelter. And so a culturally responsive way to approach that would be to say, who is this really benefiting? And who is it harming ultimately? And what kind of bonds are being broken within our communities? And then looking at veterinary services, I heard some discussions earlier today, and this is something that we're also talking a lot about, especially it seems clear that folks understand that people need access to services and that there isn't a lot. I was talking with a colleague at lunch and learning about also the veterinary shortage here in Australia that we also have in the US, where it's difficult to have veterinarians working full-time in shelters. We're struggling with that as well. They'd prefer and it's understandable given the heavy caseload and what they have to endure. They would prefer to work at the hours that they want to work, right, and make it a better quality of life for themselves, which is very understandable. So a saviorism approach to veterinary services and providing services to the community would be to say that people need to qualify or to prove that they're in need. This way, there's this element of thinking, I have somehow provided the solution that you needed, but I need to first judge whether you are qualified enough or worthy enough to receive this service. What we found in taking a culturally responsive approach is that it actually frees up a lot of time and energy to connect with the person and to find out what's going on with them and their pet. And so we've really encouraged, and something we've shifted to in the US, is to actually removing any kinds of means testing. Something that might be, and I heard a little bit a talk of this, is maybe a more targeted approach, is finding out where your higher animal intake areas are, and then offering free services to anyone who lives in that area. Another approach could be to also look at the overlap between human and animal needs. And so saying, okay, if there's an animal that's pregnant, that's going to have a higher priority for desexing. And if perhaps a person is facing a housing crisis and might be evicted, that's going to be a double priority. And maybe the desexing is going to let them stay in their home. That would be someone that you would jump the line on. So really looking at the nuances and relationships between people and their animals and what the needs might be. So I'm happy to talk more afterwards about veterinary services and what that can look like. But really, I think a more culturally responsive approach is to open doors. And sometimes what people will say is, well, how do we know that people won't take advantage of that? And my answer to that is that we want people to. You know, we're here as public charities, or we're here as government organizations providing public service, and we want people to come and join us. So I just want to touch on, I've talked about it a little bit, but the benefits of shifting from saviorism to culturally responsive, not only to your organization, but also to the community. So for the community, there's more participation, there's a more feeling of belonging, and also thinking about health equities. We've heard earlier folks talk about that the One Health approach, and also when our animals' health improves, people's health improves as well. And there's already documentation and studies that show the health inequities that exist for non-white populations, and so being cognizant of that. So it's definitely a benefit to the community, and we see that in examples of health and human services. And also to have a feeling of belonging and be represented. For your organization, you'll have fewer animals, and then animals that come into the shelters are the ones that actually don't have another outcome and can't stay with their families. A shorter length of stay, more involvement by the community, and a better working environment for folks. We heard someone talk about increasing suicide among veterinarians or people working in shelters, or the mental health traumas. So all of this really benefits everyone. I feel like today we've heard a lot of information from people who live here and from your own community. So I do feel a bit humble, and I think also hesitant to come here and to tell you about your community, and that's definitely not my intention. If anything, it's to just think and reflect more and to try to get more connected to community and to the environment around us, and to think what you could be ready for in reframing your approach, and what are you ready for with cultural responsiveness. So you could take a moment now to talk. I think it would be great if you talk with someone at your table, or you could do in a larger conversation, and see what you're ready for. And let's just spend about a minute or so before we wrap up this session. thank you all. Thanks for taking that moment to talk and hopefully get to know someone at your table, maybe someone you haven't talked to before. And I would appreciate any reflections that you have. Feel free to message me on the Whova app. Come find me. What are you ready for? What has this got you thinking about? In another conference that we went to and we talked about the same topic, one of the members reflected that they had been doing community programs and they hadn't been talking to folks in the community, that they had just been going and taking animals and getting them desexed and bringing them back, but they had never actually talked to any of the community members about what they were doing. And so he thought about now talking and going and meeting people in his community. So a reflection even like that can really be the start of something. So I just want to wrap up. I know it's been a long day, just about talking about some anti-saviorism approaches that you might have. And it's really talking about community input and partnership. We heard a lot about that, making sure that the stakeholders, I really appreciate also hearing about being invited in and not just going where you haven't been asked to go. I think that that's a key component. And really looking at what impact you're making and what's the framework. And I think a lot of times in animal welfare, we do this in the US, there's a lot of, well, what's the outcome? And what's the end result? And are we making a difference? Are we doing these adoptions? And a lot of time we have to think about what the goal might be. And what if it's more engagement? What if it's actually opening up more doors and more lines of communication and learning? I think also reframing a big key anti-saviorism approach is understanding that there's so much to learn and that there's wisdom that already exists within our communities that we just don't know about. And centering lived experience as well. I work for an academic institution and I'm not a veterinarian. I do have a bachelor's degree, but I don't have a lot of letters after my name. But I have a lot of lived experience. And I think it's important to value, I know it's important to value people's lived experience and the folks who presented earlier about being boots on the ground and who are actually doing the work. So I think that's all I have to say for right now. Thank you so much. Feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to talk anytime.